Great. Let's get started. So thanks everyone for being here. I'll introduce Grant real quick before he gets started. So this is his fourth year talk, and the title of his presentation will be What to Do If You Don't Know What to Do, a Socratic decision tree for sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agents. So Grant, take it away.
Thank you. I think someone might have their volume on. If you could mute your streams during the presentation, we would appreciate it. And if someone's unable to do that, maybe Hannah, if you could admin mute. Thank you very much. So my talk today is called What to Do If You Don't Know What to Do, a Socratic decision tree for sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agents. Before I got started, I just wanted to say, if it makes things easier for everyone, I understand these are really unique times. So we're recording this session. If you're, for reasons of quarantine or curfew, facing exigencies or choices where it'd be easier for you to go out and get supplies or resources right now, we're recording this session, so you can feel free to access that recording later. If it makes you more comfortable, feel free to turn off your screens. These are, again, really unique circumstances. The graduate students are drafting a message about how we feel at this point. Provisionally, I'll just say Black Lives Matter, and I shouldn't have to say that starting a talk like this. Lastly, I'd like to thank the faculty, Chris, my advisor, and Alan for feedback they've given me throughout my career and on this talk, and my amazing cohort and the fellow graduate students at Stanford. I've learned so much from them. And to my family and my partner, Maria Noel. They've been so helpful throughout this process, philosophically, materially, and really in every way. Okay, so let's get started. So what I'll be presenting today eventually will look like this decision tree. Now, I've left off the legend, so you don't know what those E's and K's refer to. You're not supposed to understand exactly what this means. I'm just giving you a tease of what to expect, the sort of thing I'll be modeling when I discuss decision-making in Plato's early dialogues, the Socratic dialogues, those that that Plato wrote at the beginning of his career, the earliest in time. So to motivate my project, I'd like to start by presenting you, first of all, with the text I'm actually working with as a graduate student and scholar. And secondly, I'd like to present you with a philosophical problem that you could think about either in the ancient context, or if you don't have much background in ancient philosophy, you could think about this problem just in the present tense as well. So I'll be reading from a dialogue that Plato wrote called the Laches, which again is part of the dialogues from his early career, which are the dialogues I'll be talking about in this talk. And I've given some spoilers to try to condense the dialogue as concisely as I can. And so I'm going to give away the major beats of the Laches. So it starts by Lysimachus inquiring to two kind of well-regarded generals in Athens, Nicias and Laches, that you have seen this man fighting in armor, Nicias and Laches. And Lysimachus says, we have two sons here, his son and his friend's son. The boys promise to be obedient. So we are looking into the question, what form of instruction or practice would make them turn out best? Give us your advice, not only about this form of instruction, that is a man fighting in armor, whether you think it should be learned or not, but also about any other sort of study or pursuit for a young man which you admire. So that's a typical starting point for a Platonic dialogue, especially in the early period that Plato was writing in, the beginning of his career, this Socratic dialogues, insofar as it begins with a practical question. Lysimachus sees that there's a teacher here in Athens, and his practical question is whether he should turn his sons over to this teacher or not. So Laches responds to Lysimachus by saying, I'm astonished that you're inviting me and Nicias to be your fellow counselors in education of the young men, but not inviting Socrates here, who's standing nearby. And so they bring Socrates in discussion. And once again, the practical starting point is emphasized in the question that Lysimachus restates to Socrates, in addition to Nicias and Lysimachus. He asks, Socrates, is fighting in armor a useful subject for our young men to learn or not? So I want to really emphasize this practical starting point of the what to do question that is the beginning of many conversations in the Socratic dialogues, the ones that Plato wrote at the beginning of his career. So here's how Socrates begins to answer. First, he invites Nicias and Laches to give their answer about whether they think training and using armor and shields is a fitting way to raise one's child. They each give conflicting accounts about whether it is or isn't. And so Lysimachus then turns to Socrates and says, Socrates, since what might be called our council, the three men weighing in on whether it would be better to train with armor or not, Nicias, Laches, or Socrates. Socrates, since what might be called our council seems to me to be still in need of someone to cast the deciding vote, Laches has voted in opposition to Nicias, so we would do well to hear from you. So Lysimachus thinks the best way to answer this what to do question, this practical question, is by taking a vote of well-regarded men, Nicias, Laches, and Socrates. But Socrates rebuffs Lysimachus on this and has his own idea about how best to answer a what to do question. He says, what's that, Lysimachus? Do you intend to cast your vote for whatever position is approved by the majority of us? It is by knowledge, which is episteme here, that one ought to make decisions. And the word for making decision is krinesthai, which is where we get the word crisis, the decision a doctor would make to whether a patient deserved treatment or whether they were too far gone. And so Socrates is saying, instead of voting, knowledge should be decisive insofar as we make decisions. If one is to make decisions well and not by majority rule. So in the present case, it is also necessary to investigate, first of all, whether or not any one of us is an expert in the subject we are debating or not. So Socrates has a different deliberative procedure in mind than Lysimachus proposes. So they assent to Socrates and they first investigate whether Nicias or Laches are an expert so that they could have knowledge of what the young men ought to do. But both Laches and Nicias claim not to be experts at the art of using armor and shields, and they say that they don't have expertise in this subject. So Socrates says, we certainly cannot find fault with anyone present for not being ready both to give advice, and he further does not find fault with them because not being ready to give advice as experts, they'll join in a common search for the answer of what to do since they lack expertise. So this is the way that Socrates thinks that without an expert and instead of voting, this is the way that we ought to go about answering these what to do questions, these practical questions. Socrates says, aren't these two now asking our advice as to the manner in virtue might be added to the souls of their son to make them better? Then isn't it necessary for us to start out knowing what virtue is? So that's crucial. The answer that Socrates gives almost invariantly to these practical questions is led back to knowing what virtue is through the route of the necessity of knowledge. So Socrates continues, let us not, O best of men, begin straight away with an investigation of the whole of virtue. That would be too great a task. But let us see if we have a sufficient knowledge of a part. Isn't it obvious that we ought to take the one to which the technique of fighting armor appears to lead? I suppose everyone would think it leads us to courage, that knowledge of how to use armor and fight with shields seems most related to courage out of all the virtues. Then let us undertake first of all, Laches, to state what courage is. Try to state what I ask, namely, what courage is. So that becomes a task for the rest of the dialogue, where Laches and Nicias in turn try to give an account of what courage is. But over and over again, they're led by Socrates into conflicts. And so ultimately, at the very end of the dialogue, about a page from the end, Socrates observes, then we have not discovered, Nicias, what courage is, because he's led Nicias into conflicting statements about what courage is and whether virtue has parts. And so we're at an impasse at this point, and over the Socratic dialogues end in aporia, which means without a way in Greek. Socrates has investigated a question with an interlocutor to their best of the ability, and they've failed to answer that question. So the upshot at the end of the Laches, I'll read from Socrates about what we do when we get to this impasse. Socrates says, what I say we ought to do, my friends, since this is just between ourselves, is join in searching for the best possible teacher. First for ourselves, we really need one, and then for the young men. sparing neither money nor anything else. What I don't advise is that we remain as we are. And if anyone laughs at us because we think it is worthwhile to spend our time in school at our age, these are advanced men, adults, then I think we should confront him with the saying of Homer: modesty is not a good mate for a needy man. And not paying any attention to what anyone may say, let us join together in looking after both our own interests and those of the boys. And then the last line of the dialogue, Socrates says, let's join back and meet tomorrow and get started with this project. Okay, so I've sketched out the main beats of a Socratic dialogue. We started with a practical question, that is, how should Lysimachus raise his sons? Then Socrates gave us information about how best to decide this question, whether to decide it with knowledge. When no one was announced that they were an expert in this question, then Socrates thought to get knowledge of what to do, we should first figure out what virtue is, since the answer of how we should raise our sons will be decisively connected to virtue. But unfortunately, neither Nicias nor Laches is able to define courage, and so Socrates and the rest of the gang are left at something of an impasse. The word for Socrates' question and answer method, starting from the what is X question, like what is courage, is called elenchus. That's the Greek word for it, and another translation of elenchus is examination. It's a way that Socrates can examine the question, what is X, and examine the ability of his interlocutors to answer that question. So at the bottom of this slide, I've given what's called the standard account of elenchus, and this is widely accepted throughout the secondary literature. The way that Socrates' method works in the Laches and in other Socratic dialogue is that first he'll ask a what is X question, like the one that I showed you, what is courage? Then he'll ask a secondary question and get another answer, usually from some kind of general principle. So in the Laches, the secondary question that Socrates asks is about whether virtue has parts. But sometimes it's even more general. He'll ask things like whether there's always two contraries or something like that. Then he'll derive further claims from an interlocutor based on their answer to the second question, and then show that the further claims the interlocutor has made, what are listed as S and T here on my slide, conflict with P. They're not a per se contradiction, but they can't all be mutually true at the same time. And so therefore, it's shown that the interlocutor doesn't seem to have knowledge. Either they have false beliefs or they lack the ability to defend and give an account for the true beliefs they have because they're led into some kind of conflict. So this is the standard model of elenchus. As you can see, the account of elenchus as it's standardly put forward in the secondary literature begins from the what is X question. And then when it comes to an impasse, the authors in the secondary literature judge elenchus in terms of its ability to ever license the conclusion, not P. The question is whether elenchus can ever be constructive. Can Socrates, by asking a what is X question and engaging in his classic questioning, ever come to some kind of positive knowledge, or is the best that elenchus can do merely to show that someone has conflicting beliefs and therefore isn't a good candidate for an expert? That essentially has been what the secondary literature has done to treat elenchus. My project is to reframe the secondary literature about elenchus around this what to do question, so that an account of elenchus doesn't just start with what is X or what is courage, but starts with the practical problem of what to do. So in the case of Laches again, it was what sort of education should we give our sons? And I think that by reframing elenchus within the what to do question, we can get better purchase on the impasse that comes when you aren't able to answer elenchus, and give a revised account of it that is expanded from this kind of impasse. And so you might even think throughout the talk philosophically, what should we do when we're at an impasse in our inquiry, especially about practical matters? So some scholars of ancient philosophy have used the Vlastos model, have used the standard account of elenchus to try to give it a response to what a Socratic interlocutor ought to do when they come to an impasse. But crucially, the standard account of Elenchus itself doesn't give resources to answer that question. A Vlastosian who's committed to the standard account of Elenchus can make a claim about what we should do when we get to an impasse, but their reasons and justifications for this are usually from within account of Elenchus, from within account of a what is X question, and not from within an account of the larger what to do question, which I'll be modeling with my decision tree. So I talk about a what to do question and Plato's early dialogues, first of all, because it accurately reflects the text. Frequently, these dialogues are starting with questions that begin with something like a what to do question. But you might think an answer to how we should figure out what to do in Plato's early dialogues would be to figure out what Plato's stance on practical rationality is. And an account of Socratic practical rationality could give an account of how to answer these what to do questions. In fact, that was my starting point in my dissertation research. However, in the early dialogues, there is difficulties about what we mean when we talk about rational. So in Platonic scholarship, the most frequent thing that scholars refer to when they talk about rationality is the rational part of the soul. In the Republic and other middle period, middle career dialogues that Plato wrote, he split the soul into parts, usually 3 parts. And the part that does the thinking and deciding is called the logistica, the rational part of the soul. And in the Socratic dialogues, it's much less obvious that the soul is partitioned. Socrates never really makes commitments about that. So therefore, it's not clear that there's a logisticon part of the person or some kind of rational faculty that's distinctively rational. Another test in ancient philosophy for what practical rationality consists in is to contrast it with weak-willed action. And you can say practical rationality is the sort of action that isn't weak-willed, where we're not acting against our better judgment. But famously, Socrates in the Socratic dialogues and Plato's early career dialogues denies the possibility of weak-willed action. So there's not a clear contrast class between rational action and irrational or unrational action. And finally, Socrates uses the same words in Plato's early dialogues for both practical and theoretical reasoning. So sometimes the word is phronesis, sometimes the word is sophia, but there's no strict distinction between practical and theoretical reasoning. And so therefore, it's not clear that there's a distinctive conception of practical rationality that's operating in the Socratic dialogues. On the other hand, there are some similarities between the way that Socrates answers the what to do question and what we think of when we think about practical rationality today in contemporary philosophy. And those are namely that Socrates is figuring out what to do, all things considered. He's trying to come up with a better judgment, and he's sensitive to best reasons for action. So those are all paradigmatically issues that arise in the philosophy of practical rationality and are concerns that are shared by my decision tree. Okay, what I flashed at the beginning of my talk is a normative decision tree that maps out what Socrates thinks an ignorant agent should do, or according to his ethical commitments, what he thinks an ignorant agent should do. I'm not, for the purpose of this talk, claiming that the decision tree that I've drawn out for Socrates' normative commitments is rational choice theory or normative decision theory. There's some similarities such that this applies to universally to all agents, at least at the first stage, then at the second stage only to ignorant agents. It's based on choice. It involves an agent's beliefs. It's aimed at maximization of value. It results in action, and there's normative criteria for right choice. So those are similar things you'll see in contemporary theory about decision-making and contemporary decision trees. But crucially, I'm not taking for granted that an agent's preferences are rank-ordered, transitive, or reflexive in the Socratic dialogues. Now, Josh Ober is in attendance of this talk. He has a book that's coming out on these matters. And so if you're interested in whether agents' preferences are rank-ordered, transitive, and reflexive, either on the folk theory of decision-making that ancient Greeks had or on Plato's particular philosophical theory, we can wait a year or two and Josh's book will come out on that subject. But that's not exactly what I'm claiming today. Also, it's crucial that an agent's end is objectively prescribed in this universal way, that everyone ought to be happy. Socrates is a normative eudaemonist, and I'll expand on that in a slide in just a moment. There's not a subjective conception of ends, which all rational choice theory and normative decision theory essentially takes as canon. There's some constraints like piety and justice, and oftentimes rational choice theory and normative decision theory show open constraint models. And lastly, there's no formal probability, no mathematical probability that Socrates is using to decide, or normatively one ought to use to decide between these options. So sketching a decision tree in terms of what an agent ought to do, but I don't take for granted that it'll be completely compatible with rational choice theory or normative decision theory. My project also is not asking what would Socrates do. Rather, what would the ethical commitments that Socrates hold entail for any agent? And so Socrates seems to count as the sort of agent I'm interested in for this talk because he is self-avowedly ignorant. But because of the dramatic features of the dialogues and the historical facts about Socrates, he's not the best candidate to ask my question with, because the most famous oracle in ancient Greece, the Pythian oracle, has declared publicly that no one is wiser than Socrates. He's also visited by some kind of demigod that warns him whenever he's about to act unjustly. He believes, because of the Pythian oracle, that he's been sent on a mission from God to improve Athens. And he thinks part of that mission includes making his fellow citizens virtuous. He thinks he's bound to obey the laws of Athens by some kind of social contract reasoning. He has a famous reputation for irony. And maybe most importantly for my talk today, Socrates is extraordinarily skilled at elenchus. He's really good at asking a what is X question and then leading someone into conflicting beliefs by just asking them questions. Some of the most famous experts in Greece are led into conflict by Socrates. And so these are particularities that I'm not thinking about for all agents. When I'm asking about the what to do question in the Socratic dialogues, I'm imagining it for any ignorant agent, not for Socrates in particular. And because of these facts about Socrates, observing what he does dramatically in the dialogues isn't a absolutely clear way to discover what Socrates' normative commitments commit any ignorant agent to doing. So I have this what to do question that we saw launched the dialogue, the Laches. And that's the focus of my dissertation project. Today, I'll be presenting about chapter 3 of my dissertation, this decision tree for sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agents. But briefly, to motivate what's going on and explain what's going on in chapter 3, I'll talk a bit about what occurs in chapter 1, which is essentially just reviewing the secondary literature to find some well-established views about what Socrates' normative practical commitments are. And then we'll turn to chapter 3 with those resources. I don't have a strong argument in chapter 1 besides about the constraints on Socrates' commitments. So I wanted to present a more robust philosophical problem for this fourth year talk we could all think about. Once you reach an impasse to the what is X question, what do you do? And how does elenchus help answer the what to do question if it inevitably or over and over again leads to an impasse or aporia? So turning to chapter 1, these are the Socratic assumptions about normative ethics and action that I'm interested to translate into some kind of practical decision procedure. So it's very well established that Socrates is a normative eudaemonist. And what a normative eudaemonist means is that the answer to the what should I do question is be happy. Now it's possible to be lots of different kinds of normative eudaemonists. You might even think of pleasure hedonist, let's say, is a version of normative eudaemonism. If they think what everyone ought to do is get as much pleasure as possible because that makes people happy. So just because Socrates is a normative eudaemonism leaves a lot of room open for his particular variety of beliefs about what makes people happy. And let me contrast assumptions 1, 2, and 3 with assumptions 4 and 5 on the bottom of the slide. For the purposes of my talk today, I don't need to take assumptions 4 and 5 on board. I'm really trying to generate a decision tree through a decision procedure out of assumptions 1, 2, and 3 alone. And I wanted to bring up these bottom assumptions first because I wanted to contrast normative eudaemonism with psychological or descriptive eudaemonism. Normative eudaemonism is the view that what you ought to do is be happy, that that's what's right for human beings to pursue. Psychological or descriptive eudaimonism is an observation of what people are actually like. So Socrates, as I've put in parentheses, is committed to the view over and over again that everyone always chooses to do what to do because they think it will make them happiest. Now, descriptive eudaimonism might be relevant for my talk, because if Socrates is able to convince someone of these normative assumptions, by assumption number 5, the person will then be committed to actually using this decision procedure. It'll have the effect of translating these assumptions into action, because psychologically the agent is unable to do otherwise. But nonetheless, when we're asking the what to do question and deciding what to do, I'm arguing that the first 3 assumptions are what is crucial. So the first assumption I've talked about, normative eudaimonism, that Socrates believes everyone ought to be happy. And then the further 2 assumptions bring virtue into the picture for Socrates. So a helpful phrase that Vlastos came up with in 1985 is that Socrates believes in the sovereignty of virtue. And what that entails is that according to Socrates, according to Vlastos, what an agent decides to do is the considerations of what an agent decides to do are completely exhausted by thinking about what is the virtuous thing to do. So there's no other practical consideration that an agent should reflect on to decide what to do besides being virtuous. That might be too strong for my purposes. Terry Irwin has expressed the view that you can never go wrong by pursuing virtue. It can never hurt. That might be a little too weak for what I'm trying to show, but it's widely agreed upon in the secondary literature that on Socrates' particular variety of normative eudaimonism, that in order to be happy, one should try to be virtuous, that's the way to secure happiness. And then the third assumption is virtue intellectualism, that if virtue is crucial for happiness, in order to be virtuous, you have to know what virtue is. And there's a question I'll return to later in my talk about what constitutes knowledge for Socrates in the early dialogues, and this will have practical implications. And so there's a question about assumption number 4, which is, in order to know what virtue is, define and defend your definition of virtue. In the secondary literature, it's widely accepted that Socrates is committed to something like assumption number 4, the priority of definition. But since my talk is about any sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agent, it's not clear that they would be able to access the priority of definition. So a normative decision tree for any sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agent would include these first 3 assumptions, and we can talk about these latter 2 assumptions in questions or in other parts of my dissertation. So chapter 2 of my dissertation, after laying out Socrates' assumptions about normative ethics, namely that he's a normative eudaimonist, and his idea about happiness, that it's constituted by virtue and the tight connection between virtue and knowledge, there's a practical upshot for Socrates that the first thing that you should do is to know yourself. And in the Charmides, what this gets cashed out in terms of is knowing what you know. And this is crucial for welfare, since as we saw in the Lakis, Socrates thought the first thing we should do to answer a practical question is find an expert who knows. Unfortunately, they couldn't find an expert in the Lakis, and therefore they asked the what is X question. But if you have knowledge, it seems like you're not then required to ask the what is X question to figure out what to do. And so self-knowledge seems like the first step for everyone, not just for ignorant agents, when deciding any practical question, when answering the what to do question in Socrates and Plato's early dialogues. Okay, so now taking stock of everything I've said so far before we get around to the decision tree and look at chapter 3 of my dissertation, there's 3 key assumptions that I've put on the table that I'll be writing about in chapter 1 of my dissertation. That is normative eudaimonism, you ought to be happy; the dependency thesis, that in order to be happy, you should be virtuous; and virtue intellectualism, that in order to be virtuous, you need to know what to do. And so happiness, in order to secure that, is connected to virtue, and virtue is strongly connected to knowledge. And so therefore, I'll argue in the first chapter of my dissertation that the first kind of knowledge that one ought to pursue to see, to answer the what to do question, is to see if one has knowledge of virtue oneself, so that you can answer the what to do question, and the decision procedure would have one step. Do I have knowledge of what virtue is? The answer might be yes. And if the answer is yes, then you have knowledge of what to do according to Socrates' 3 assumptions I've listed above, and therefore you're able to answer the what to do question. But if you pursue self-knowledge and find that you're ignorant of knowledge of virtue terms, then you go to step 2, and that's chapter 3 of my dissertation, the one I'm presenting in this talk, and I've sketched a decision procedure for those that are trying to answer a what to do question, that and so committed to normative eudaimonism, therefore they're trying to be happy and trying to choose whatever decision would make them happiest. They'll do this by choosing the decision from virtue, but in order to do that, they have to have knowledge of virtue. If one lacks knowledge of virtue, then you're in the position of chapter 3 of my dialogue. You know yourself, and you're crucially ignorant of virtue knowledge. And so then from this position, we've reached the impasse that frequently occurs to interlocutors when they have been revealed to have conflicting beliefs through elenchus. And what Socrates recommends at the end of the Laches is that all the interlocutors return the next day to go and find an expert together. That seems to be the upshot of what Socrates thinks we should do after we reach this impasse in elenchus. An alternative that Socrates sometimes suggests at the end of the Euthyphro dialogue or the Protagoras dialogue is not that they go off and search for an expert, but rather that they just continue elenchus. And Euthyphro and Protagoras say they're too busy right now, they'll have to do it some other time. But it seems like what Socrates recommends when they get to this impasse in all the early Socratic dialogues is either that he and the interlocutor go off and find some expert, or that they continue questioning, they continue the process of elenchus and hope to come to some solid positive knowledge of a virtue term through this kind of question and answer method. And so now I've mapped out, and hopefully you could understand better what this decision tree is mapping, what an ignorant agent has available as options for action. And I'll be thinking in this talk about what an ignorant agent should normatively decide to do. This isn't a descriptive decision tree. This isn't what is actually occurrent and necessarily in a sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agent's mind, but rather this is according to Socrates' normative commitments. What should any sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agent do? And most accounts of elenchus, the standard account of elenchus that I've described, is only able to reach the very first stage of this chart. So the type is very small. I'm going to leave screen sharing for a moment. And now pull it back up so I can zoom in. So the very first stage on the decision tree is the typical, what we typically see in Socratic elenchus. Either elenchus reveals the ignorance of agents, as it has done in the Laches. It's shown that Nicias and Laches don't know the answer to what is courage, or elenchus can fail to reveal ignorance. And this is typically the case in Socratic dialogues. Very often, Socrates encounters interlocutors who, for some reason, are put off by his method and therefore aren't fully convinced by having been led to have conflicting beliefs. And therefore, they might be resistant in one way or another. So that's the sort of agent I'm trying to leave out when I write sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agents. Down here at the bottom fork, the bottom branch of the decision tree, you might have ignorant agents who aren't self-avowedly ignorant. They've faced elenchus, they've failed it, but for some reason that doesn't move them to sincerely accept their ignorance in a self-avowed way. Another option is that an agent really is wise, and so they're able to pass elenchus, and so they have an answer to the practical question, because from their answers about virtue, they're able to decide what to do. But the situation I'm focusing on at chapter 3 is when we move up then to the second branch. And the big decision, as I mentioned in my previous slide, is between either finding an expert or finding a definition of virtue terms. And so that's represented by the two options at the second branch of the decision tree, to either seek an expert or to not seek an expert, but to inquire directly. If you don't seek an expert and inquire directly, there seems to be two options. One is that you use Elenchus to discover an adequate definition of virtue terms. The other is that you test your beliefs over and over such that you're able to come to a set of beliefs that never lead into conflict. And there's options in the secondary literature that consider both of these possibilities constructive, that is, things that Elenchus is able to positively generate knowledge. And so if you can get knowledge of virtue by having a holistic set of non-conflicting beliefs, or if you can get knowledge by discovering individual definitions of virtues via Elenchus, those are two routes to attaining knowledge to answer the what to do question. The other branch on the tree is to seek an expert. And so if instead of inquiring directly, one might go out into the world and see if there's any self-avowed experts that one can use Elenchus on. Then an expert would either pass or fail, a self-avowed expert would either pass or fail Elenchus. But there's a question about, even if an expert passes Elenchus, whether this is a genuine expert or not, because one might still not trust the results of the method of Elenchus. Particularly, one might not be as good as asking questions as Socrates. Socrates is able to find equivocations and detect distinctions that interlocutors are making in a really expert, skilled way. But if one is kind of unacquainted with how to practice Elenchus, one might find that an expert could pass your questions but still not really be an expert. And so therefore, it seems like you would want to develop a Elenchic skill to be able to question them as well as Socrates can, so that you can have trust that if an expert passes Elenchus, they're genuinely an expert. And then the final branch on the decision tree is just an iteration of the first branch. It has the same exact two options, but the only difference is it's now occurring after one has looked for an expert. One has run out of self-avowed experts to look for, and so then one can either just give up inquiry or inquire directly in the absence of an expert, in a similar way as the inquiry was proceeding if you don't go look for an expert at all. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to full screen mode. And this is what the decision tree looks like when we apply the letter K for knowledge, and that's the aim, that's the outcome that any sincere self-avowedly ignorant agent should be going for. To answer a practical question about what to do, they're looking for knowledge of what to do. And my claim is that on any branch of this decision tree that ends with K, that is definitely if you find an expert, and then I've put K question mark because it's for a self-avowedly ignorant agent, I take it an open question whether it's possible that Elenchus is constructive, whether Elenchus can generate positive knowledge. That doesn't seem to be something that a self-avowed ignorant agent can decide either way at the point of the decision tree at which I'm writing my chapter. But if you see even the possibility for K at the two forks of the second branch, the top fork of the third branch, and both forks of the top fourth branch, E comes before K. It's impossible to get to the end of any of these branches and find K without getting to E first. And so that's the crystallization of this impasse problem, that if we're conducting Elenchus and we're finding aporia at the end of Elenchus, when we ask a what is X question, we're unable to answer it. According to the standard model of Elenchus right now, there's no clear upshot to do once you reach aporia. There's no kind of clear practical account of what the role of this aporia or impasse is from the perspective of answering the what to do question. So by reframing Elenchus, which usually is just all the way to the left on this tree, the very first decision, within this broader framework of Socrates' normative commitments about ethics, we can see that Elenchus is just embedded within a larger decision procedure and a larger kind of practical goal, which is figuring out what to do, not just answering the what is X question. And so what's decisive for me is that both on the branches of the decision tree that lead to finding knowledge by finding an expert, or that lead to knowledge by discovering knowledge oneself, one has to pass through E to get to K. One has to practice Elenchus and likely encounter these sorts of impasses en route to knowledge, because developing a lankic skill is a necessary condition, it seems like, for knowledge, whether you're inquiring directly or for a uh, confirmation of expertise that one can really put trust or faith in. If one lacks a lankic skill, one can't be sure that one has actually shown that an expert has knowledge. So no matter what, according to whatever branch you take, eventually for Socrates, if you want to get to knowledge, which is crucial for happiness, according to the three assumptions I presented, you're going to have to pass through a lankus, and the sort of impasse that was the problem for Vlastos, and the problem that Laches, Nicias, and Socrates are left with at the end of the Laches. And so there's something I'm calling an Elenchus upshot of this decision tree. When you're answering the what to do question, either you end up developing a heuristic to test experts, and these can be virtue experts, or they could even be Elenchus experts, who you're looking for an expert who can teach you the skills of Elenchus, so then you can go off and find virtue. Either of those, it seems like, would first require developing a lankic skill, or otherwise, if you're inquiring directly, trying to find definitions or trying to find a holistic set of true beliefs, it seems like you need to get good enough at Elenchus to do that. So developing a lankic skill, on my account, is not a bug of Socrates' practical philosophy, but rather developing skill at Elenchus, and first by reaching an impasse and then by going through Elenchus over and over again, is a necessary practical step to acquiring knowledge. So on my view, that kind of solves the impasse problem that Vlastos and others face on the standard account of Elenchus, to explain why Socrates over and over is leading his interlocutors into impasses, when the purpose of the dialogue is to answer a what to do question. How does the result of an impasse contribute to what to do? My answer is that, in fact, it's a necessary condition to acquiring knowledge according to the ethical and practical commitments that Socrates made, that I presented at the beginning of my talk, and which will be in chapter 1 of my dissertation. And then just to gesture at where I'm going in my final chapter of my dissertation, I'm interested in these sorts of methodological questions that an inquirer would ask at these different stages of the decision tree. Questions like, what is expertise? What is the difference between true belief and knowledge? What constitutes a definition and an adequate defense of a definition? Lastly, you might wonder about prudential concerns. If a baby is about to fall into a well, it doesn't seem like Socrates would think that what we ought to do is develop enough Elenchic skill to get knowledge of virtue so that we know we should rush over and save the baby. The baby will have fallen by then. So there seems to be constraints from justice and piety, constraints about maximizing the abilities of developing Elenchus that might lead you to turn down an opportunity in the short term to maximize opportunities in the future. So these are other sorts of questions I'm interested that come up along the way of answering the what to do question. And so in conclusion, Socratic assumptions about normative ethics and knowledge invariantly direct an ignorant agent to acquire virtue knowledge. Whether an agent seeks knowledge of virtue via self-directed inquiry or from an expert, these assumptions direct a sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agent to develop a Elenchic skill and route to attaining knowledge. When facing practical questions like how to raise their children or whether to prosecute their father, Socrates' normative assumptions about ethics and action generate the invariant recommendation that sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agents should practice Elenchus while perhaps addressing methodological questions that arise along the way. So that's my fourth year talk. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you. And first of all, my apologies to everyone. I thought the session started at 11:30, but that in fact was an error. But I may as well do some work now. And so we'll start with questions. And first, if there are any questions from graduate students, Thomas.
So thanks, Grant. That was really interesting, and there's a lot of exciting stuff there. You might be able to predict what my question is going to be, but how do divine sources of belief fit into this whole model? So I was thinking of two examples in particular with Socrates. first the daimonion, whom he never seems to interrogate, but just takes on whatever the daimonion tells him not to do, almost unreflectively, it seems. And this has been a problem in the secondary literature, of course. And then second, the oracle at Delphi, which you mentioned in your presentation at various points. So it's true in the Apology that he says he's going to elenchize the oracle, but at the same time, he first claims that the oracle never tells any lie. So it can't be that he's trying to evaluate the specific claims, I would think, that the oracle is making. And two, when he tells us how he's going to elenchize the oracle, he doesn't say, I'm going to engage directly in elenchus with the oracle. Rather, he's going to go and engage in elenchus with other experts, and then that might show that the oracle has misspoken or he's misunderstood what the oracle's saying. And so it doesn't seem like the response there is either seek knowledge directly or directly interrogate the expert who's giving you these beliefs, but there seems to be a third option, namely trust the god and then do other things.
Thank you very much. So first of all, these questions about what Socrates would do are slightly orthogonal to what I'm trying to present in my dissertation, which is at a level of generality that's broader than the particular circumstances of Socrates' life or something like that. And one of the reasons I'm doing this is precisely because of the sorts of divine relationships that Socrates has. Socrates might have resources for deciding what to do on his own that not every ignorant, every sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agent can help themselves to. But nonetheless, Socrates is self-avowedly ignorant. There's a question about how sincere that avowal is. But so we might be able to find some helpful results or guidance for creating a decision tree according to how Socrates acts with these divinities, since he's an example of a self-avowedly ignorant agent, and he's committed to the normative commitments, normative eudaimonism, the conditionality thesis, and virtue intellectualism. So he seems like a sort of candidate that this decision tree should apply to. I mentioned there was constraints about justice, piety, and prudential concerns on the decision tree. Piety is a constraint that I'll be talking about on the normative commitments of maximizing happiness in the first chapter of my dissertation. So this is a question that I'm interested in answering in. That is the best reasons someone has for doing something compared with proclamations from religious authorities about what is right, or from the government. Let's say Socrates is committed to obeying the laws as well. So those seem to be constraints on what you might have otherwise as your decision about what's best to do, all things considered. One last thing I would think about when answering this question is the degree to which knowledge is accessible from these religious sources. Socrates' daimonion, the divine entity that speaks to him through injunctions, through negatives, don't do that, or through the Pythical oracle, who publicly announced that no one is wiser than Socrates. It seems like the very fact that Socrates needs to perform elenchus to understand the Pythian oracle shows that he doesn't have full knowledge of how to interpret the oracle. And similarly, he can't interrogate the daimonion who just says no. So therefore, because knowledge was so crucial, according to the assumptions that I presented from the conditionality thesis, it seems like even if you get really valuable or secure information from religious authorities, you don't necessarily have knowledge about the what to do question. And here again, we might be forced into asking, what is knowledge for Socrates in the Socratic dialogues? And I'm interested in the practical upshot of that question. How much are ignorant agents forced to answer this question about what is knowledge? I guess in the presence of religious authorities or religious entities, this would become an even more pressing question about whether what we're getting from them counts as knowledge or not, which could discharge this conditionality thesis.
Just really quickly to make sure I understood that last bit. So you seem to think that the what to do question is left open, even to one extent or another, even after you've received this divine intervention. But so when Socrates in the Apology tells us that, I was deciding whether to come to the law court or not and defend myself, and the daimonion not intervening made me decide that it was right for me to come to the law court. Are you thinking that the what to do question is still open in that case? Because Socrates seems to be viewing it as kind of shot, right? I was supposed to come to the law court. That's what I was supposed to do.
I think when the daemonion doesn't intervene, it only shows that the decision that Socrates is making can't harm him. I'm not sure that it's actually beneficial. It's just that you're not committing any injustice by going forward and doing what you're about to do. And what's crucial might be knowledge of what to do in a very particular situation, which you could get from an oracle or from a divine injunction, versus knowing what to do in general. So maybe I could grant that in these particular cases, Socrates doesn't maybe need a linkus when the daemonion tells him particularly, don't do that. He doesn't need to inquire into that unless he wanted knowledge, which is crucial according to his assumptions. And so that's where the knowledge question comes back in.
Okay, Michaela.
Hi, thank you. I just had a clarificatory question about the decision tree. So you were saying that in order to get to K, you have to pass through E. So I was just confused about the very first junction. So if you go right, you can get to the agent is wise thing where you have knowledge without passing through E. So I was wondering why that is.
Great point. I'm sorry for the small type for people who have trouble seeing this. So I'll describe it as best I can out loud. The first fork between Elenchus reveals ignorance and Elenchus doesn't reveal ignorance is a fork that takes place in the second chapter of my dissertation, the question of self-knowledge. That's what has practical priority, discovering whether you're ignorant or not. So I'm imagining this first step is kind of outside the scope of my second chapter, which is a Socratic normative decision tree for self-avowedly ignorant agents. And so you would need to see at that first fork, you would need to take Elenchus reveals ignorance to be a self-avowedly ignorant agent. The other two options, if you take the other branch, is to be a self-avowedly wise agent, the agent is wise, or to not be self-avowedly ignorant. You're resistant to Elenchus for one reason or another. You've been shown that your beliefs are contradictory or that you're unable to defend your beliefs, but nonetheless, you think Socrates has done something underhanded or you're just not convinced. You still think you actually know. And so for that reason, that K is off the table for a sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agents. But you're right that if someone's wise already, then they don't need to practice Elenchus to figure out what to do. They just instantly know what to do. So for chapter 3, I'm restricting the branches to the top 3 ones. And if the bottom branch was available, then you're right. There is a way to get out of practicing Elenchus and facing these aporii, these impasses on the standard account of Elenchus. But we can rule out the bottom branch in the case of a self-avowedly ignorant agent.
Okay, I see no more graduate students on the list at the moment. I insert Wendy, the number of whose questions and can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the parts of Gaul.
Thanks for that. I don't have to ask them all now. I can just be put on the list again. But so Grant, this is a cool project, and I am a sucker for a good decision tree, so thank you. So my first question was about self-avowed experts, and so whether they are, and so I just don't know a lot about this account. What role is self-avowal playing? So the background thought is I'm less trusting of people who are very sure that they know what virtue is, say. And so what's the role of self-avowal? Is it necessary? Is it sufficient? And how does it sort of play into and how do I know? And I know this is maybe not, these are not questions that you need to answer for your project, but how would I know if they were a self-avowed expert? Is it through the Elenchic process or is there some other process? Thanks.
So avow just means that you go around asserting that you are an expert. That's all. I just mean an assertion by an avowal. And you've put your finger on a very interesting problem that comes up at the very beginning of my talk, if you are paying close attention to the Laches. Lysimachus just asked Laches and Nicias what he ought to do, because these are famous generals with good reputations in Athens. And it's Nicias and Laches who say, Socrates is standing right here. Why don't we bring him into this conversation? So initially we have a situation in which Lysimachus is looking for an expert, and the experts that he goes to, this isn't really self-avowed experts, but they're those that have a reputation in Athens for knowing what to do. But from the very beginning of the Laches, this idea of identifying experts and ignorant agents like Lysimachus going to the right person is kind of crucially thematized, because he starts the dialogue by precisely going to the two people in the dialogue who don't have a good answer to the what is X question, and not asking Socrates, who's standing right there with much more elenchic skill when it comes to these sorts of questions. So it's definitely a live problem about identifying experts. But because this ignorance is so crucial for Socrates, he always maintains that he has ignorance about the most important things, knowledge about this virtue, etc. It seems like if someone's going to have knowledge, or if someone claims to have knowledge, either they really do or they don't. In the cases where they don't, Elenchus would reveal that. On the first part of the fork, you might practice Elenchus, but realize that you haven't developed adequate skill at conducting the method. And so even if someone passes Elenchus, you might think, was that really a genuine pass? And so it seems like you need to therefore develop elenchic skill, E, at this stage here, before you can have a genuine test for an expert. There's a view that's put forward in the Charmides and elsewhere, and this is connected to Socratic intellectualism, that if one has knowledge in the Socratic dialogues, one knows that one knows. And so with Charmides, the question is about temperance. And they say, Charmides, are you temperate? And if the answer is yes, then it's assumed that Charmides should be able to give an account of temperance because he has it present inside of him. So at least he knows its effects. He knows what it's like and can give a description and account of what it's like. So that Socratic intellectual thesis entails that if someone really did have knowledge, it would be a current, they'd be aware of it, and therefore they'd be a self-avowed expert. You might have false experts that are deluded, that have pretended knowledge, but Elenchus will be able to test out those experts before you identify the one that really does have knowledge. But maybe, as your question suggests, there are these candidates like Socrates who don't consider themselves experts, they're not self-avowed experts, but they still seem like the best shot we have at figuring out these practical questions. But it seems like what Socrates does is just to inquire directly with people. He says, don't come to me for knowledge. Together, we'll go to the second or fourth fork, inquiring directly rather than using expertise that I have already settled or something like that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, David Hills.
Yeah, Grant, fascinating stuff. I'm wondering about just a question about how the setup's supposed to work, and in particular, I mean, you seem to want virtue intellectualism to be a core part of the commitments here, but seem to want to allow for successful agents who aren't themselves in possession of definitions or accounts, or I mean, and I take it that I take it also, could be wrong about this, that what Elenchus does is hammer away at proposed accounts or definitions. So I guess I'm wondering, well, two questions. I guess, you know, does the scheme envision the possibility of fully virtuous persons? I mean, you know, therefore, fully knowing persons who don't have an account of their own up their sleeve, and what might be what may or may not be really distinct. Can there be experts without accounts up their sleeve? I mean, and I guess one more question, either prompted by that, or, you know, perhaps what prompted the more specific questions. I mean, if one's going to have a distinction there, it looks as if it looks as if there could be, as it were, two different ways of displaying a linkic skill. Um, 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 Playing a good defense and of an account one oneself professes, and just playing a good offense where it's a matter of where it's a matter of being able to take on the other guy's account and do so in sort of the in the right way. I mean, there might be ways of blowing the other guy's account out of the water that would be in some way suboptimal as so can we have account-free experts, and can we have account-free virtuous people who lack an account of their own, but develop and display a linkic skill simply by playing offense.
Thank you for your question, David. Very interesting. So let me go back to share my screen. So first of all, we have a question about the possibility of faring well or being a successful agent on this account in the absence of knowledge. One question, first of all, that comes out about expertise without an account, or a successful agent without an account, is whether we take on board assumption number 4 at the bottom of the screen here, priority of definition. If we take priority of definition on board, it seems like an account will be a necessary condition for having knowledge, that you won't be able to have expertise without something like the priority of definition. My view right now is on the decision tree, it's an open question for an ignorant agent about what constitutes knowledge. And so as I have it right now on the decision tree, the agent doesn't help themselves to assumption 4. And the way to discover whether, in fact, knowledge requires a definition is to pursue a constructive elenchus that would generate a definition, and the proof would be in the pudding if you're able to do it or not. It doesn't seem like prima facie there's considerations that would be determinative for a ignorant agent or not. Another important consideration for your question, David, is how strong we consider the conditionality or dependency thesis. So in the Euthydemus, the sorts of reasons that virtue is listed as necessary for happiness, the one thing that Xanthippus should pursue above all others if he wants to fare well and be happy, is because it secures the right outcome. It's secure, otherwise he might use his property wrong, or he might do the wrong thing. So there, just the presence of an expert who could tell Xanthippus what's right, what action is best in the situation, seems like it would be sufficient for the best outcomes for an agent if you had some kind of ideal advisor always there to tell you what to do. Some of Chris's research on the Euthydemus points to an even stronger conditionality thesis that couldn't be discharged by an ideal expert advisor, and that is something like an appreciation condition, that in order to be happy, you not only have to do the right things, but you have to appreciate why you're doing them. And that appreciation condition will actually unlock the vast amount of value that right action that is available through right action. So without knowledge, one won't even understand why one's doing what one's doing, and that would be maybe crucial to what constitutes the value of eudaimonia or something like that. And so those are two considerations to answering your question, David. And then if you remember my last slide, I brought up these sorts of methodological considerations that might occur to an ignorant agent as they were going through the decision tree. And so if you look at the expertise questions, you see first, what is expertise? And so you might ask the exact sort of question that you just asked about what is the minimum requirement for an expert? Is knowledge gradable? Or is it sufficient to be an expert that you just get right outcome success and can train your students, but you can't give an account, let's say. So I think these questions will come up to a agent as they pursue a Elenchus, and these questions might need to be answered before you can eventually get to knowledge. And so I'm interested in not just the possibility that, according to the normative decision tree that I've drawn, an sincere, self-avowedly ignorant agent must go through this impasse of aporia when they practice Elenchus, but additionally, they might need answers to these sorts of questions before they're able to finally get to knowledge. And so the questions that you're asking, David, seem like natural questions that would arise methodologically as one worked out what the practical upshot of these normative commitments are.
Okay, moving on to Josh Ober. And if you have a question, send me a message via chat. And since Grant has to teach at 12:30, I'm intending to stop at 12:25.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Grant. Really interesting work. So the basic question I have is Socrates an infallible Elenctic expert? So it's motivated by the observation that Socrates himself seems quite able to act in various ways that might seem to require some real moral judgment. I mean, he goes to war and presumably participates in killing people. That doesn't bother him, apparently. Anyway, other things. So at least one possible way to think about this is that there are some premises or potential definitions or answers to the what should I do question that have been proposed that have not been knocked down by Elenchus. Now, maybe it's in conversations with others. Maybe Socrates has just proposed them to himself, and then he hasn't been able to come up with a refutation. On the other hand, it might be that he doesn't consider himself to be an infallible expert in Elenchus. So therefore, the fact that it hasn't yet been knocked down doesn't mean it won't be knocked down by some better argument in the future. And so the answer to the what should I do question could in that case be act according to the unrefuted premises of the answer to that question, with the recognition that you are not acting out of knowledge, you're simply acting on the basis of things that haven't been proved to be wrong yet. That would at least allow you to get on with your life and do various things, answer that question in a hypothetical kind of way without believing you actually had it, without ever saying that the best thing to do isn't to keep on digging and keep on pushing harder because you want to actually make sure that the things that are left actually have survived the most expert kind of testing that they could possibly have. At least that would seem to square the idea of a Socrates able to act in a positive way. And obviously he's got his daimonion to stop him in case he makes a really serious mistake. But the daimonion only says, don't do that. It never says, do that. So he has to have some reason for acting for the things he actually does do.
Thank you for that question, Josh. Excellent question. This is a normative decision tree. In life, if you were to have an actual decision map of the sorts of decisions that people actually make, it seems like Socrates, I mentioned the case of the baby on the edge of the well. There's certain interpretations of Socrates that push him towards an ascetic lifestyle, but there's also interpretations in the secondary literature that argue that Socrates' commitments don't entail something like asceticism. You don't need to kind of completely withdraw from practical concerns in the world. And this is evidenced throughout the dialogues. In the Crito, there's a good example where Socrates explains to Crito that what he's doing now and what he's doing in the past is always the thing which has appeared truest or has appeared the best option in his previous discussions or something like that. So it's clear that Socrates does in fact act on his best judgment according to the beliefs that he thinks have survived Elenchus the best or something like that. But in what I'm calling a normative decision tree, there's this question of what is the best thing to do, or of all things considered, what should an agent do in these situations? And according to the commitments that I've laid out that include the conditionality thesis and Socratic intellectualism, what normatively we ought to be doing, what's the most crucial thing in these situations, is getting knowledge of how to act. And so I'd argue that normatively, what seems right, all things considered, in most cases, is that you're developing a Elenchic skill. That's something that you have to pass through on any path to knowledge. But as I've written on my slide in blue that I referred David to, let me share this one as well. In the upper left-hand corner, I have the question of how do justice, piety, and prudential concerns constrain my pursuit of knowledge? And here, prudential concern seems like something that is coming up, that some things, like a baby about to fall in a well or many other things, there's some kairos for them. You have to act at the right time or the opportunity for action is completely gone. And so I guess in my fourth chapter in my dissertation, I'll have to be tackling this question of how you balance what you normatively ought to be doing, all things considered, which is developing a Elenchic skill, against constraints of justice and piety, which would lead you to act quickly because it's commanded, or just prudential concerns, that it's the best thing overall, maybe even for my developing Elenchus, that I take some kind of practical action in the short term. So that's my answer to your question right now, Josh, but I'm going to keep writing about this and keep thinking about this question. Thank you for the question.
Alan Coe.
Okay, so Grant, I'm very glad that you were stressing the way that not just a standard account, but really all of the accounts of the Socratic procedure, the secondary literature, on the one hand, acknowledge the three, the first three of your assumptions. That's not controversial, but don't try to incorporate their interpretation of what the method consists in by reference to those. They look at something else. So you look at Blastos and, okay, yeah, you have this slide up. He's starting with an answer to a primary question, and usually what is X, sometimes it is X, Y, some secondary questions, and then tries to show that something untenable for the interlocutor follows, that they're in disagreement with themselves. But Vlastos's account doesn't try to show how this is motivated by those three assumptions. If you were to do that, you'd have to, just as you're saying, you'd have to bring it to an earlier stage before posing the what is X question, bring it back to some practical question, and eventually lead it to the part that gets treated in the secondary literature. Now, one of the things that I've noticed in talking to you about this, looking at the chart, that I think nobody does anything with this, so I'm not faulting you for not having it all worked out, but go to the very end of the chart. If you start with the question, what to do, or T protein, at least in some cases where it's successful, you're doing something other than, say, developing a Elenchic skill and just practicing that. So one example might be the way the dialogue, the Crito begins. Crito's bribed the jailer. We have an opportunity now to escape from the prison. And Socrates' initial response isn't great, let's go, but rather he and Crito, according to Socrates, have agreed on something, and this is a fundamental that draws the line between the people they can agree with those that they can't. It's never right under any circumstances to inflict harm or to do something wrong, even if you've been harmed or wronged. But we will examine it again. So the fact that that has passed whatever this means, passed Elenchus over and over and over again, and this is something that they've been committed to for a long time, doesn't by itself answer the what to do question. They're going to examine it one more time. And as we all know, he doesn't leave the jail. There is a decision about what to do. He's going to stay put. And part of the argument is clearly not Elenchus. It's an argument designed to show that he would be doing something wrong and would be, if he were to escape, be harming the laws. And the laws, the Nomoi personified, come and give him a whole set of considerations. Now, that's not Elenchus, so it does seem that something other than Elenchus as a method should be incorporated into the decision tree. But what I'm trying to urge you to do now is to think a bit more about, you do have some outcomes and you develop that in your writing. So if you go to the top and right of the tree, it's not that you're just ignoring an outcome. If there's a what to do question, you have some answers. But I think that there's a way that you can expand it. And so I guess the main question I have is, if you were to do that, is that something that you think can also be motivated the way you were motivating the earlier stages of the tree, simply by looking carefully at those three assumptions that are not controversial and that everybody agrees to? Or are we going to need to bring in something else? Like, he did need to bring in some other kind of argument, and the law is talking to him. So you've shown at least that you can get certain results, and these aren't necessarily the kind of results Blastos was talking about, a positive result where you're entitled to claim knowledge, but positive results in the sense that you're asking a question, what to do, and it ends with you doing something. But is it going to always be something when you get to the answer, what to do, that you can motivate the way you've been motivating things up till then? I mean, that's what I'm thinking about now.
Thank you, Alan. Great question, and I'll continue to be thinking about this. So one place that my mind goes to are these questions, these methodological questions that I listed at certain points in the decision tree. One possibility that I'm considering for chapter 4 of my dissertation is the way in which the early dialogues, which is the entire scope of the entire dissertation and the entire scope of my presentation today, lead into the middle period dialogues. And there's been recent work on this by a scholar who's also worked on Elenchus named Hugh Benson. His book, The Cleitophon Challenge, is about the development of Plato's hypothetical method. So somewhere in the transition in Plato's career between his early career and middle career, he started writing dialogues like the Phaedo, where rather than a strictly inquisitive question and answer method that Socrates was putting forward, there was also hypotheses that Socrates was suggesting, and then a method for investigating those hypotheses that's pretty involved, so I won't go into it right now, to confirm whether the hypotheses are true or not. And so it doesn't seem like the hypothetical method, or this is a decision I'll have to make, is whether something like the hypothetical method falls within the scope of Elenchus as I'm describing it in the Socratic dialogues. And part of the answer to that, Alan has helpfully pointed out, might be determined by thinking about the way in which the hypothetical method, like Elenchus, is generated out of the practical a practical question in tandem with those three main assumptions that I'll be detailing in the first chapter of my dissertation: Socratic eudaimonism, the conditionality thesis that virtue is necessary or crucial for happiness, and that knowledge constitutes virtue, Socratic intellectualism. In the case of the Crito in particular, I'm not all that satisfied that what has occurred is normatively the way that we ought to always decide. Socrates describes the arguments that convince him to stay in prison that are given by this personification of the laws of Athens as some kind of persuasion that isn't fully rational. And he compares himself to a korybant, a cult practitioner who's been swept up in some kind of mania, the way that is a similar way in which he's being persuaded by the arguments of the laws in Crito. And so it doesn't seem like, according to the emphasis on knowledge and the three assumptions that I've given, what Socrates ends up with at the end of the Crito is in fact kind of normatively robust enough to answer the what to do question. He seems to be convinced in this non-logical way. But nonetheless, there might be some other resources that would occur to an ignorant agent as they try to decide what to do, and the way that the sorts of methodological questions that I've written here on the decision tree at these different stages might lead to something like a hypothetical method is something I'm interested in, and would try to draw back to the three main assumptions that I'm working with.
So the hypothetical method, at least the deployment of it in this context, you think could also be motivated by those three assumptions?
Absolutely. And it might be motivated by this exact framework and these sorts of methodological questions that come up, where somehow the only way to answer these methodological questions is to go to something like the hypothetical method.
Well, that would be even better if that turned out to be the case. It is puzzling to me now, the way you've set this out so clearly, why it hasn't already been done. But in any case, thanks for that answer.
Thank you.
Okay, we should stop here. My thanks to Grant, to all the participants, and especially to Hannah, and for introducing Grant. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate it.
Well done, Grant.
Cool. And I will stop recording now. That works.